Welcome. Today I'm here with Tiago Forte. This is the second time I've interviewed him, and we're going to be talking about his new book, Building a Second Brain, and also his course, Building a Second Brain. He's also done some angel investing in the PKM and accelerated learning productivity space. So we'll get into that a little bit, talking about the future of productivity, accelerated learning, and PKM, and some other interesting things that he hasn't been asked about much before. So I think it'll be a good time. So, Tiago, thanks a lot for coming on.
My pleasure, Timothy. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah. So, we were just talking before we started recording about trade-offs, and some of the trade-offs that I thought were most interesting are the just-in-time versus just-in-case. You also have compression versus context in terms of how you take your notes. But you also mentioned there's this idea of having a universal system that no matter what Windows or Mac or Linux or what software you're using, or whether you're digital versus physical, and sort of paper, uh, there's a trade-off there. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. So I think we should start there, and maybe you can riff on some of these ideas.
Yeah, which of the devastating trade-offs do you want to start with?
I think the universal versus tech frontier thing. I'm interested what you have to say about, because that's kind of the future, and part of the theme I want to talk about today is just kind of laying out what we both see as the future of PKM.
Yeah, I think I'm just very clear, and I try to be honest that my system is making a very specific trade-off, which is choosing to be universal. It's
Mhm.
choosing to be platform agnostic. And what I mean by that is, yes, any operating system, Mac, Windows, Linux, any device, smartphone, tablet, computer, even smartwatch, any software program, Notes app, there's, I think, over 40 or 50 different software platforms that people have used to take my course successfully. That all that doesn't come at no cost.
Mhm.
There is a cost, which is we have to basically retreat from the technological frontier and use technology that I'd say is at least 10 years old.
Yeah.
Like if you want to be universal and completely agnostic, you have to be 10 years behind the current times. And in a way, Evernote, which is what I use, is sort of the winner of last decade's war. I've been using Evernote 10 years, Instapaper 10 years. Most of the apps in my stack are 10 years. And there's another
Yeah.
trade-off you can choose, which is to be on the technological frontier and use the features of a specific app.
And I use OneNote, and I use an older version of OneNote, so I'm to say I'm a dinosaur as well. I'm still using OneNote 2007 as, but I was
Nice.
just telling you before the call, I've been using Apple Notes more and more, and you just put up a tweet about that, like kind of how you go through the phase of starting at Apple Notes, then getting into all the different, Obsidian, Notion, all the different things, and then getting back, you kind of return to the basics. So I thought that was really funny. Um, it, Now, one kind of difference between us, and you were saying you're getting back into paper books. I'm very paper heavy. I'm always printing stuff out, and then I'm annotating it with my pens, and so filing cabinets and stuff like that. And it's gotten to the point where it's like so much stuff. Now I'm thinking, okay, maybe I need to depaper. Maybe I need to uh, back up the trucks a little bit. Um, so okay, and the universal thing also is like it's hard to take advantage. You think about, hey, there's this new innovation with this app or that app, but then you're not sure, hey, how will that fit into my system? And is this sustainable over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? And I'm curious, I mean, do you think about, 25 years from now, 50 years from now, can I, uh, with a library, you might pass that down to your kids, your grandkids. Whereas if it's all in a Kindle, if it's all in, your Notion or your Evernote, can you pass that down to the next generation? What does it mean to have something that's sustainable and very long term?
Yeah, wow, such interesting questions. So for the first thing, there's another pitfall. There's
Okay.
being too much on the frontier, but then there's the people. Mostly I've met them in Silicon Valley. It's often, people who've been around like since before the dawn of the internet, or the type that like builds their own computers or like thinks about like standards,
Yep. Yep.
hardcore nerds who think on too long of a time horizon. Yeah, they're
Yep.
preparing they're trying to document information in a way that's going to be accessible in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. I think that is lunacy. It's arrogant. It's completely bonkers. Like, yeah, you can, like I've been part of serious discussions in like meetup groups in San Francisco where they're like, okay, well, it's not enough to have it, hard coded onto metallic discs that are buried in a fireproof safe in your basement because they're still all in one location. There was a nuclear blast right above your house, probably wouldn't survive, like with a straight face. And I'm just
Mhm.
like, okay, this isn't relevant to most people.
You've read about sorry written about quantitative self, and I think you went to part of some of those meetups. So I think that's another interesting trade-off is quantitative versus qualitative. How do
Hmm.
you know, some of my clients, they want to go overboard with the quantitative stuff. And I'm kind of saying, you shouldn't be living your whole life in a spreadsheet. There's a time and a place to be quantitative, uh, but it shouldn't be going overboard with that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, that's another that trade-off is just everywhere all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
what I think about is like this thing where I remember earlier in school that we were sort of sorted into the basically left brain types and the right brain types. The left brainers, were the ones that were good at math. They were shuttled off to advanced math classes, advanced science classes. They were advised to join the chess club or, there was like a whole lifestyle that they were directed to. And then the right brain people got directed to music classes and art classes and drama and theater and all those things. And I think for various reasons, I didn't fit into either one of those.
Yeah.
Um, Partly due to accidents. Like for eighth grade, I was in Brazil. My parents took us to Brazil for a whole year. And so I missed the eighth grade in the US. Well, the eighth grade is when, at least where I live, was where they sort you into math. And so I came back to the US for ninth grade and they put me in. Yeah, I missed the opportunity to do advanced math. But my mind is very analytical, right? I'm not naturally very artistic. So I was just kind of free floating in this no man's land. And, I didn't feel like I fit into either one. And when I talk to people these days, they have that same feeling. They're
Mhm.
probably smart and analytical, but they're also creative and imaginative. And the world doesn't recognize those two sides of ourselves. They want us to pick one. And
Mhm.
I kind of feel like a second brain is the fusion of them. It's
Yes.
quantitative, it's engineering, it's systematic, procedural, process oriented, yes. And it is imaginative and magical and mystical and
Mhm.
free form and organic and bottom up. It's both. You have to embrace both.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of your logo is the two halves of the brain.
Yes.
Um, that reminded me also before the show on trauma type learning. I don't know if you frame it through sort of a behaviorism or something else or a combination of things versus intuition is, emotion versus logic and the intellect, intellectual learning versus trauma learning. That's kind of the negative side of the emotional learning. But you have written about trauma recently, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is really it's funny because I withdraw from the technological frontier partly so that I can be on the idea frontier, is how I see it. You can only be on one frontier,
Could you
right?
say that again? What are the two?
Yeah, so I don't want to be on the bleeding edge of the technological frontier
Right.
so that I can be on the idea frontier, right? Like if all your time is on tooling, updating tools, replacing tools, maintaining tools, troubleshooting tools, you
Right.
just don't have the time and the bandwidth to like immerse yourself in complex, very, innovative ideas.
Yeah.
Um, so trauma, I think, people have said recently, oh, we talk too much about trauma. We call everything trauma. I disagree. I think we barely even begun to
Mhm.
to breach what trauma even is or is about. I actually kind of think it's kind of like in like the 1950s, there was just mental illness. You
Yeah.
were either crazy or not. It was binary, right?
Mhm.
And decades later, we now know there's this whole world of mental illness. There's dozens, hundreds of different forms that it takes and symptoms and manifestations. I think that that's where we're at now with trauma. We think,
Mhm.
oh, you either have trauma or you don't. No,
Mhm.
it's more like this cornucopia of different flavors and types. And I just think it explains so much. It explains people's problems at work, their challenges in relationships, their challenges with their health, with everything. I mean, it's just it's like there's this term trauma aware. I think
Mhm.
we're going to have trauma aware. We already have trauma aware like education. We're going to have trauma aware productivity, trauma aware collaboration, trauma aware note taking, because it is just the fundamental patterning of our nervous system as
Mhm.
it relates to information.
So what is trauma based? Would you say trauma based note taking? Like that's I have a I don't understand what that means.
Yeah, I just came up with that term. I don't know what it means
That's a
either.
good one. That'll be in the headline.
Yeah, yeah.
New
The
concept.
clickbait.
Yeah.
Everything you need to know about trauma aware note taking. I don't know, man. I mean, I'm writing about this. I just
Okay.
yesterday uh, came up with the first draft of a post on one flavor of trauma, which is intergenerational trauma.
Mm.
So it's like the very most recent thing I've been working on. But so it's interesting. I've never road tested this line of thinking, but I very rarely even talk about, this subject on anywhere. But think about there's a different way of thinking about trauma. Imagine if we kind of speak about trauma as if it was a disease.
Mhm.
We use a disease metaphor. Oh, like I have trauma. I've been traumatized. I'm healing from trauma, being cured from trauma, which
Mhm.
is that very binary thing. Imagine if trauma didn't have a negative connotation. Imagine like it's really hard because it has such a negative connotation. But what if trauma just referred to the way your nervous system functions?
Mhm.
Like good, bad, positive, negative, right? So, like, as one example, in people's fundamental relationship to information, they tend to have a default way of approaching new information. Have you noticed
Mhm.
this? Some people are just fundamentally, oh, there's new information coming in. Amazing, interesting. Like, let's discover this. I'm curious to see what is arriving as it's coming at them, right?
Right.
And so when it arrives, they're in such a receptive
Mhm.
state of mind for that. Other people, the information is coming. It's like, oh no, here we go. Oh, it's going to be some new, terrible, awful thing to happen to me, which in either case, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It ends up
Mhm.
being what you expect, right?
Mhm.
So that's just one example.
Yeah, I think that's cool. It makes me think of the sort of big five openness to experience, the ocean model,
Yes.
OCEAN. And so that's a key one. And, I think that the intellectual in general is sometimes a person who's been traumatized by the emotional sphere and
Yes.
they've kind of retreated into the world of the intellect. And so
Yes.
that's a journey that you go on to kind of come out of the cave or come out of that um, retreat.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. I find that's very, very often the case.
So let's go back. So I did want to go over code in Paris. So maybe you can do a little bit on both of those. Kind of explain. Those are two of your key acronyms, and they kind
Yep.
of structure your framework and your methodology.
Yes. Yeah, that's the very core of what I do. There are two four-letter frameworks. I'm a big fan of four-letter frameworks.
Hmm.
To me, it's like five is way too many, three is not enough. Reality is best described in four parts. And the reason there's two of them is they're very different. Para is how you organize things. It's how you store things. It's a storage framework. Code is how you do things. It's an execution framework.
Yeah.
And those are very different. Storage and execution are practically opposites. One is about static long-term preservation. One
Mhm.
is about short-term dynamic producing of results.
There's kind of a
Uh,
trade-off there as well.
there is always a trade-off. But there's also like a synchronicity
Mhm.
or a synergy, which is para is a kind of very simple action-based way of storing things, with really one principle in mind, which is at the moment that you're trying to take action, how do you want to be able to access information? That is the guiding question. How and where do you want to see the information that you need to take action?
Mhm.
And my answer to that is on horizons of actionability. You want to see short term, medium term, and long term is the simple answer. And what we tend to call those things, short term, we tend to call projects. Medium term, we tend to call areas of responsibility.
Mhm.
Long term, or as needed, we tend to call resources and archives.
Mhm.
And that's it. It's a storage framework mated with an execution framework.
So maybe you could talk about, I'm kind of curious how the book writing process was for you and like how you maybe that help people understand. One of the diagrams I really like that you have is the two triangles coming together, and it's the divergent thinking in the first half, and then the convergent, and that seems to me to be lined up with code and or para. But maybe you could talk about how those link up.
Yes. So where this came about is code is 4 parts, which is wonderful for intellectual understanding. But when it comes to, I'm always so interested in like that moment when you sit down at your computer,
Mhm.
like that's the moment of truth.
Mhm.
Like, what do you do first? What do you do next? To me, the answer to that question over time is the trajectory of your entire career in your life. Like, it's
Yeah.
just next, what's next, and then what's next, and then what's next.
Mhm.
And I found just for myself that code was too complicated. 4 options is too many. I need two.
Mhm.
Two, like at the most fundamental level, it's actually funny because that's in a way all the mind can do.
Mhm.
Like if you have a list of things, let's say you're at a restaurant and you have like, 25 things you're trying to decide between. If you really notice closely, mostly what your mind is doing is just choosing between 2 things. Right? Like you have your first choice and then you're scanning the rest of the menu and just comparing each item with that first choice, which is
Mhm.
maybe like the default thing that you order, like pad thai at a Thai restaurant, and then
Yep.
you're just looking for anything that might beat it in a one-on-one matchup.
It's hard to do.
It's hard, right? And so I needed something even simpler, and I found an answer in design thinking. Divergence and convergence, is straight up design thinking from the 80s and 90s. Except in the 80s and 90s, they were using it to improve basically the design process. I'm getting that very same framework and just applying it to practically all knowledge work.
Mhm.
And the practical use for it is I just sit down and I just ask myself, for the next work session, whether that's 10 minutes or an hour or 5 hours or whatever, is this a divergent work session where I'm expanding and opening the scope of possibilities? Or is it a convergent work session where I should turn off my Wi-Fi, close the door, silence my phone, and just narrow in on a concrete outcome?
Mhm. So I like that's one of the things I really like, and I've drawn from your work is this idea of when you're finishing up the current work session, I think of it kind of like there's some people that park forward, kind of facing the wall in a parking lot, and then there are people who back in, and I'm one of the people that backs in, so I'm like ready to go next
I
time,
love it.
and
I
I
love
feel
it.
like it's kind of like that, and I think it's like 90% of people just go front end instead of backing in. But it's so I really like that, and it it does keep the momentum, and I think that's one of the toughest things. Is another thing that I've gotten from just how you write. You've spoken elsewhere about and written elsewhere about um, how you do your blogging,
Mhm.
and this is something that's always tough for me. Is like taking one thing all the way through, but the way you do it is you have like 20 or 30 different drafts at different stages, and you're kind of like, what do I feel like? I mean, this is kind of how I approach creating my different courses, so I guess I kind of do that, and it is very random and chaotic, but then I'm just kind of switching from thing to thing. So I get a sense that you take that approach to blogging, and that's worked very well for you. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, yeah. This is I call it, it's sort of like having many kettles boiling.
Hmm.
You always want different things cooking at different speeds on different timelines with different kinds of results.
Hmm.
I think the reason for this is I think I'm a pretty emotional person. Like
Yep.
I'm pretty governed by my emotions, actually, perhaps surprisingly. So I find it literally impossible to work on something that I don't feel like working on. It's just,
Yep.
it was never even remotely going to happen. And so instead of fighting that, I think that's to different degrees true for most people. But they basically fight it, they repress it.
Mhm.
And I understand, like, when I worked for a company, I mean, you can't always work on what you feel like working on, right? So
Yeah.
I think it is important maybe to know how to do that, to change how you feel to match what you're working on when
Mhm.
needed. But when I became self-employed, it was largely because I couldn't fight it anymore. It just took too much energy. It took so much energy, I had no energy left to actually make progress. And so how I sort of square that circle is have many things going on at different stages of development. The key here is they are all preserved and saved in a place outside my head.
Mhm.
Like you cannot work on multiple things at different stages of completion using your first brain. It's
Yep.
just not going to happen because every minute that's passing, all those memories are decaying, context is being lost, details are being dropped, right?
Mhm.
Which is very stressful. So a second brain is sort of a necessity. But once you know how to, it's almost like I think of it like, when you're playing a video game and you can just pause at any time,
Yeah.
right? Like
Save
when you
game.
were, yes, save game. When you were like as a kid and your mom was like, it's dinner time. If you could just hit pause, it's no problem. You just
Yeah.
pick up right where you left off. Imagine if you were playing like 10 different video games and you could just turn from one to the other. And at every one, any progress you made was saved. And
Mhm.
you never had to go back and start earlier than that point, right? Then you could essentially, I think the point of all this is just to be able to leverage however you feel,
Yeah.
right? No
Yeah.
matter how you feel, there's a kind of work that matches that feeling.
So I'm curious, like when you have these blog posts, is there a companion Evernote page where you're kind of, I mean, I think about whether it's a video I'm making or a course or a blog post, it's always like a project, like a mini project. And so I use my project template to just plan it out, and then that'll generally have a companion in the blog post or the video that's kind of the deliverable of that project. So are you doing that, or are you kind of putting notes in the back end of WordPress or whatever you're using?
Yeah, I've tried more systematic, formal ways many times.
Yeah.
Templates, status, like a status, you know,
Dashboard and all that stuff.
dashboard. I can never stick to those things. I just can't for whatever reason. So I tend to use sort of uh like little just contextual details as sort of their own documentation. So for example, in a typical Evernote notebook folder, the default way that I sort notes is reverse chronological order. In fact, this is my favorite default like organizational method anywhere is reverse
Yeah.
chronological order
Yeah.
from most recent at the top, least recent at the bottom. Sort of like the Facebook feed, right?
Yep.
Like things that just happened, and then you scroll down and things that happened in the past. Which, if you so there's a couple of things here. To me, this is kind of amazing. Reverse chronology is amazing because computers can do it perfectly. That's one of the few kinds of organization that a computer's like, I got this. I know exactly when each note was created, and I'm not going to make any mistakes. But second, there's something very natural about that. I think it's because it's like a pile of papers on your desk,
Mhm.
right? Most recent papers on the top, oldest papers on the bottom. There's something very natural about reverse chronology. And so with reverse chronology, I just look at the most recent note, which is also at the top, the last thing I did. And that usually just tells me the place that I left off at in the project. If I need more details, I just go down the list further back in time and can almost always find, the detail I need.
Yeah, I'm the same way, and I think it preserves kind of the breadcrumbs of like, oh, I went here and then I went here and then I went here, and I can then sort of, I'll oftentimes be looking at my downloads folder and then just select all the things of like when I was researching that thing and then go put it in a folder related to that topic. And so the dates preserve that. Um,
Totally.
another thing, when I'm trying to sell somebody on the idea of you need to have this PKM, the second brain, you need to have, you don't fully realize how important this is until you have the system and you go back to a course you created 5 or 10 years ago, or a blog post you wrote 5 or 10 years ago, or the notes or the folders you had, and you're like, wow, I don't even remember reading any of these books, writing any of these notes. It's like And sometimes you find stuff and you don't even realize you wrote it. You think, oh, who's this writer? And then you remember, oh yeah, these are my notes from like 10 years ago. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because like I think it's only once you've gone over the hill and you've gotten this system in place and had it for 5 or 10 years when you actually realize like the gargantuan amount of time saved and not starting from scratch. Like you're in level 5 or 6 of a 10 level game. Going back to level 5 versus starting at square one each time is such a massive difference.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you're so right. There's these moments, these beautiful, beautiful moments. And it does take some time because you have to have that record to refer back to,
Yep.
right? But yeah, I mean, there's a few different ways that it can show up. Like one is, yeah, just going back and remembering.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's because what you learned back then is only now becoming relevant,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I have the example in the book. 4 or 5 years before I hired anyone, could even imagine being able to afford hiring someone. I'm reading an article about Google's hiring process, the questions they ask, the things they look for, what's important, what's not important, and saved a few highlights. And then 4 or 5 years later, the fact that I can ask a question like, what do I know about hiring? Like, what in the past have I discovered about hiring? Do a few searches and find there was a whole number of things from years in the past that, like you said, I didn't even recall having ever seen. And then to distill those items, synthesize them, usually into a memo. I'm a big fan of internal memos,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even if it's just for myself. And then to have that be the collection as if I had been researching the subject continuously for 5 or 6 years.
By the way, how
Like,
do you organize those memos? Are they
I just
emails or?
I have I usually do writing in Google Docs. So there's a folder in my, it's like a subfolder of my inbox that is like draft memos, and then I have
Okay.
draft articles.
But like, is this like in a shared workspace for your team and then a separate Google Doc for each memo, or?
Yeah. So separate Google Doc for each memo, and I write them as if I'm going to make them public.
Okay.
So like defining terms, not making assumptions, not having big
Yeah.
leaps. Like I actually write them as if they're going to be a blog post, which they often become,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like sometimes you're just like, oh, this is just my own little personal strategic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like we just wrote a memo. I wrote it with my manager of YouTube about our YouTube strategy. And by the time it's finished, I'm like, holy crap, if we just add a couple of graphics and a nice title, this is a killer blog post,
Mm-hmm.
right? But anyway, write them in Google Docs. Yeah, my inbox is shared with my team,
Mm-hmm.
so they can just go in there and see anything. And then I usually solicit comments from them first. Like it's funny. It's like I want to be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
When I share that thing, I want that. And it takes, when people join our team, this is often the thing that they have the hardest time adapting to. They're like, the CEO is surfacing, revealing all of his thinking and all the reasoning
Mm-hmm.
for the purpose of having mistakes and assumptions and blind spots called out. I think it's just very different from how most companies operate, but they do. It's
Mm-hmm.
amazing because they see things in the business that I don't see. They have more contact with customers than I do.
Mm-hmm.
And so what emerges out of that feedback process is a way better piece of writing, which is also a better piece of thinking, which leads to a better decision.
Yeah, that reminds me of the way Eisenhower kind of changed the White House. He really opened things up. He'd have these weekly meetings and get everybody talking. He
Interesting.
was one of the first to share stuff with the vice president, who was Nixon. And so he just really opened things up and opened up the conversation. He actually liked to write a lot of memos also. Um, but with these memos, or with your inbox in Google, uh, this is a Google Drive, and then you have a folder within. So you have like an inbox folder and then the memos folder, and just everybody has access to that.
Yes. So my Google Drive is the cloud storage
Mm-hmm.
that we use as a company. So we all have an account. My Google Drive is organized with Para, of course.
Yep.
So projects, folder, areas, resources, archives. And then at the top, I just have
Mm-hmm.
a fifth initial folder, which is the inbox, which is just where things live while they're in development before they go into Para.
So it's kind of like Steve Jobs' iPara.
Yes.
People sometimes ask me, I think I also have a four-part system. I just realized that because I have the work and then personal and then relationships and then health. But I've
Hmm.
got a fifth one that's numbered zero and it's meta. And I
Hmm.
find people are always like taking stuff from other areas and they're like, oh, that really belongs in meta. And like everybody's meta that I looked at actually has a bunch of different stuff in it that it shouldn't like officially be there, but it is. So it's like funny how that happens. But so I just saw, I think on your blog or on your Twitter that you just gave a Google talk. So I was
Hmm.
wondering what that was like. And I mean, you probably gave a fairly standard presentation, but I'm curious what it was like before and after. Like, what is it like giving a Google talk?
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, it's kind of a huge career milestone. I think Google Talks are kind of the new TED Talks. TED Talks have kind of lost some of their
Yeah.
luster. Been too widely, those ideas worth spreading were too spread. They spread too much.
Yeah.
So Google Talks is the new TED. They put a lot of preparation into it. The hosting of it is like nothing else I've seen. There's a
Mhm.
intro graphic, and then there's essentially like a stage manager behind the scenes, making like manually making one person full screen and then showing you both and then showing my screen. It's all very seamless and dynamic.
Wow.
And it's funny talking to Googlers because in a funny way, it's like what I'm teaching and recommending is it's sort of like how to survive in a post-Google world. Like the,
Mhm.
the information landscape that Google has just completely shaped is the landscape in which we operate and in which second brains are necessary. So it kind of felt like going back to like the source, like this is ground zero for the information explosion.
Mhm.
And the talk, like you said, was pretty standard. I told my story. I
Yeah.
find that my story is pretty essential to kind of, if anything, to humanize me because people think I'm like a productivity machine or something.
Yeah.
It's all very human. Came from managing a health condition,
Mhm.
uh, and then I kind of go to what I realized and learned based on that story. Uh, and then I actually went into Normally I go into like three top takeaways, three top lessons, but they wanted to have it be more interactive, and so we did a Q&A, and then I concluded my story at the end.
And then what was it like after? Did you get any interesting questions?
Yeah, there were some follow-up questions. I think there's more questions in the YouTube comments for that video. There's always
Oh,
more
okay.
questions.
I'll check that
I
out.
never I never seem to address more than about 5% of the
Yeah.
questions, right? The more questions you answer, it just generates more questions.
But I mean, is there like an official Q&A afterwards, and then people maybe come up to the stage and kind of get in line and they're asking you questions one on one?
Oh, it was virtual. The talk was
Oh, it was
virtual.
virtual. Okay, I didn't
Yeah.
realize that. I just saw the front thing on it, so I was like, oh, he was over at Google.
Pre-pandemic, it was in
Yep.
person, and I
Yeah.
would have
Yep.
loved to do it in person, but now it's
Yeah.
all, it's all virtual.
Yeah. I thought they'd kind of gotten back to normal, so I just missed that. Um, Okay, so I think this idea of alienation from work, the anti-work movement, I maybe I'm being too extreme, but I think I've noticed in the productivity space over the last really year, there's somewhat of a malaise. There's somewhat of a feeling like there's no more progress to be made. I think Obsidian and Logseek, they've kind of, it's not clear how much they're going to change the game and how they relate to Notion and what Notion is doing. But I get the sense that there's kind of a death of, there's these two converging threads of kind of, is there anything more left to discover within productivity? But also concomitant with that, is there a realization that, and probably COVID has put this into relief, is there a an alienation from work itself, or a questioning of, is there more than just productivity? And that happens at the corporate level, and employees are the victim of it. But then there's also, you're kind of a victim to yourself if you impose in an authoritarian way these productivity quantitative things on yourself. You end up getting burnt out. And both of us, I think, have realized this, and we are very intuitive, very emotional, very much listening to our intuition and then going where it takes us, and we have systems built to do that. But I'm wondering at the more cultural level or at the more big picture level in the space itself, are you sensing these things, and do you have any thoughts on them?
Yeah, it's always interesting sort of analyzing the trends. There are definitely these, it's like waves, these tides, these undercurrents in like the culture, in the, in the zeitgeist, I guess you would
Yeah.
say. I've noticed some of those too. I think, gosh, there's so many things. There's the post-COVID, like, what is it? What is it called? The Great Resignation,
Yeah, great resignation.
which has two meanings, literally resigning and also just resigning yourself to your fate,
Mhm.
or becoming resigned, right? Actually, has three meanings. That's definitely happening. There's the saturation of like overly complex note-taking systems, which I've definitely been a part of. I feel like I've, if anything, been a voice to not overcomplicate it, but whatever. Then there's the Gen Z people coming up. I see this a lot on TikTok. Gen Zers just not being interested in following, even less so than millennials, the typical career ladder.
Mhm.
Uh, the explosion of the creator economy. More people than ever, especially after COVID, are either working remotely or have side gigs online or are fully becoming self-employed. It's a lot of converging things.
Mhm.
I think though that you can't say, I don't think there's one cycle.
Mhm.
It's not like the economy where it's like, oh, are we growing or are we in a recession? It's like one or the other. There's all these cycles happening at different levels, different timescales with different groups of people. I think the long term, though, I'm obviously totally bullish on like the definition of productivity that is synonymous with creativity is
Mhm.
what I really care about. Productivity as the fusion of quantity and quality, of productivity and creativity, of left brain and right brain, all those things we were saying, is a definition that applies to the corporate people and also the online creators,
Mhm.
applies to just a wide range of people.
I mean, with YouTube, I've been hearing more of this stuff about creators, being slaves to the YouTube algorithm, and that these kind of algorithms, they want to incentivize content creation and being a creator. The good side, it's never that you don't have a boss. It's just that when you're a creator, you either have one patron or you have, your thousand true fans, or you have some other kind of method, but they're still kind of your boss. They're still kind of paying your bills, and you do have to be, there's another trade-off. Do you be the starving artist that sacrifices money to pursue your goals, or you optimize, or there's so many different choices you can make there, and there's kind of the being a slave to the algorithm, which the algorithm is kind of just capturing statistically what the hive mind wants. And we
Yeah.
even, maybe you have some ideas from sci-fi. You're much more well read in that than I am. I don't know if that brings to mind anything you've read or thought about, but creator wellness and creator mental health day, breaks and stuff like that. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, the dark side of the creator economy, and if you back that up a step, the dark side of productivity, spending too much time in your system.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, to speak to the YouTube thing, as a team, we're really getting into YouTube more and more.
Yep.
I think that's the future of our business. Honestly, it's just so huge,
Yep.
and it is interesting. It's like when you have a blog, there's the whole kind of mindset of if you build it, they will come. Like just write deeply, passionately about something you really care about, and you'll find your audience. That was only like half true when it comes to a blog, right? Like you need to have catchy titles. You need to think about the framing. You need to promote it. You need to like have things that attract people. But on YouTube, it's just in any algorithm driven platform. It's like a culture shock to me to
Mhm.
be on YouTube and to realize that these little minute changes, like a little moment, like in the first 5 seconds, that
Mhm.
just surprises you or catches your attention or piques your curiosity can make a 10x impact on how many people watch your video easily. Like we see this in our our analytics.
Mhm.
And so that mindset of, oh, I don't care about the market, I don't care about the algorithm, I'm just going to make
Mhm.
stuff that I care about, makes no sense. Why am I going to spend all this time producing videos that no one's going to watch?
Mhm.
And so I feel like I'm a pretty grounded person. I'm pretty grounded in like what like I care about, my principles and values.
Mhm.
But I feel that whole of the algorithm is like this gravitational force that is hard to resist. It's so hard to resist. But it can so easily, I kind of liken it to like worshiping the algorithmic God.
Right. Right.
You wake up in the morning, you're just like, what? Like, just replace the word God with algorithm. What does the algorithm want? What is the algorithm's true purpose for my life?
Mhm.
What is the algorithm? What is the algorithm trying to tell me? Like, it's the
Yeah.
new God, and it's
Yeah.
just a very powerful force.
Yeah. Sort of analyzing the entrails within your analytics
Yes.
account.
Like, yeah,
Um,
developing superstitions and like
yeah.
weird routines and rituals. Please, it's a complete religion. Yeah.
um, and I think of audience capture as well. Have you ever had situations where you thought about like, am I getting audience captured by this or that thing, and do I need to resist that? Whether it's a certain app or something like that.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty stubborn, which is
Yeah.
my like my bulwark against that.
Yeah.
It's a funny realization I had recently is that I'm not very customer centric, never have been. Um, I rely on these days, especially I rely on my team for that
Mhm.
because I just don't have that much customer contact. I teach our course, for example, but there's now like a teaching staff, there's a teaching team
Mhm.
that has more exposure to them than I do. So I think that's sort of my protection. But yeah, it's so hard to avoid. I mean, you pour your blood, sweat, and tears into these pieces of content,
Yeah.
and it's like how to make them more spicy. You just
Mhm.
know. And it feels a little bit like you're selling your soul, but then you start to get into fractions. Well, am I willing to sell like 10% of my soul for like 5x growth? Well, how about like 25% of my soul for it's like it becomes
Yeah.
this
Yep.
sliding scale.
So I want to get into kind of other aspects of the future. You've done some angel investing. Maybe you could talk about some of the companies that you've invested in, what that experience has been like, and I think not sure if you or David Perel talked about this, but like it's a great way to keep in touch with what the where the future is going, and kind of learning about. And I've found that to very much be true. Just investing in general, and it really challenges you to make predictions about where we're going in the future. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and the cast of mind it gives you.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Sci-fi is just, I mean, gosh, it's just such a rich collection of ideas, and a particular kind of idea. It's ideas that are wild and speculative,
Mhm.
really outside the norm, that really go against norms and tradition and I mean, the way the world is today. But not just that, they're also practical. This is the science in science fiction.
Mhm.
Like they have, they're in line with principles of physics. They're in line with what we know about energy and matter and time and space. They are in line, they have a connection to current technology. Like you can extrapolate from current technology. So I guess what I like about sci-fi is that interplay between the imaginative and the practical, like everything, seems to be the theme here. But it's just crazy to me that you can do these essentially like thought experiments. That's what a
Yeah.
sci-fi story is. Nothing nothing about it is true or not true. Like how could you ever know? They're just interesting or less interesting. That's the scale. And so you can do these thought experiments that these authors do and really understand the present world,
Mhm.
and I think predict the future, right? I mean, the future is unknown, but not 100% unknown. It's not completely unknowable. There are hints and there are clues.
Mhm.
Um, if you're open-minded enough, and that's what sci-fi gives me, it really helps me see into the future. Uh, Not because I'm like, oh, I read it in a sci-fi story and I like it, so therefore that exact thing will happen. It's more like I've read 30 different scenarios of what
Mhm.
might, I don't know, the future economy look like. 30 different scenarios. So having been primed with those, what those look like, when something happens in the news,
Mhm.
not like, oh, this is a completely novel thing I've never considered. I'm like, wait a minute, that reminds me of a scenario. That
Mhm.
reminds me of a story. And so it's like in my mind, the probability that that scenario is going to come true just goes up one little notch,
Mhm.
right? It's like, oh, let me put a little more weight on that pathway.
So, like an example, like Neuralink. What do you think you'll get the Neuralink? Do you think your son will get the Neuralink? Do you think you and your wife will be communicating via Neuralink? All that stuff.
Yeah, so for that, I would rely more on the past than the
Okay.
future. And I would say for like for sure, it's going to happen.
Hmm.
But it's going to take way longer than people think. There will be way, way more intermediate steps, very gradual incremental steps. It'll be very messy for a long, long time with real costs, big trade-offs, accidents,
Hmm.
mistakes, tragedies, but eventually it will happen. I mean, there's kind of no that Neuralink is just the zooming out. Neuralink is just one little step on a far longer arc of
Hmm.
humans leveraging their cognition using technology that started with, the tablets in Sumeria, 20,000 years ago. So from that perspective, it's inevitable. It's just won't be as simple as Elon Musk coming out on stage next month and being like, okay, it's ready. It's perfectly final. You can install it now. Here it is.
But he seems to be saying like this is going to be operational in 5 to 10 years.
I know. I know. But I mean, look at
So
Tesla. Like,
yeah, they
like
didn't meet all their deadlines.
Yeah, they didn't meet their deadlines, but it's funny. It's like, okay, their mission is to, accelerate the energy revolution. They are both fantastically successful at that
Hmm.
and haven't even made a drop in the bucket. Like those two things can be true. Like, it's every mission or goal is just part of a bigger one, and you're
Hmm.
never finished or complete. It's fractal. It's like concentric circles.
So I'm curious, how you've been thinking about your son's education. Does he have a second brain yet? What is he in Notion? Is he in Obsidian? Can we make any news here? How are you thinking about his education and his, getting into storing his knowledge and using all these processes?
Yeah, his second brain right now is us. He outsources all tasks to his parents.
How old is he? I forgot.
He's almost two.
Almost two. Okay.
No, he's living the dream. No worries, no responsibilities, no goals on any level. I mean, it's inspiring. Honestly, I aspire to this. He just every moment of every day just moves towards what he likes and what he wants without any reservations, any shame, any concepts of what he should want or needs to want. He's just a pure little desire seeking machine. And it's kind of amazing how well that works. Like, of
Hmm.
course, we have to be, running behind him, kind of protecting him and stuff. But
Hmm.
it's something I always notice is like the highest rate of learning in our entire lives, which is as toddlers,
Hmm.
basically, infants and toddlers, are very free form, emotional, kind of chaotic, just running after things you like and things you enjoy and things you want. And we think of learning as like structured and all these things, but the best learning seems to happen in quite unstructured environments.
Yeah, I've been noticing more. I've been getting questions about how do you incorporate this stuff, parents with their kids. They want to get their kids using this stuff. I remember my K through 12. Um, in my K through 12, there wasn't a lot of continuation from grade to grade, and a lot was lost over the summer. And just I didn't see a point in trying to maintain things. And then so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and then also just the future of the university. And I know you're doing some investing stuff in that area. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on either of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think PKM digital note taking is sorely missing from schools. I mean, gosh. imagine if we had these tools. Imagine if we could capture these bits of knowledge on the fly as they were happening in a centralized place where we always knew how to find it. We could search it all, distill it, review it, create things from our own perspective. I mean,
Mhm.
it's almost like school is designed specifically for a world in which something like a second brain doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So what do you have to do? Review things constantly, but also
Mhm.
you, you can never remember things from the past. So yeah, start over next year, just on some completely unrelated subject. Have these things called tests where you have to cram into your head all this stuff because that's the only way to recall things. It's all predicated on there being no way to overcome the limitations of memory.
Mhm.
Also, like on other assumptions too, like you have to do it all yourself.
Mhm.
Crazy, this idea. And then you enter the professional world, everything is collaborative. Nothing is done by yourself. Everything depends on the feedback of other people. Oh, and by the way, you can reference your notes anytime.
Yeah.
I think school just needs to adapt and change. And one reason we went down this traditional publishing pathway was talking to school principals, educators, teachers, bureaucrats. They really look to signals of credibility,
Mhm.
right? They're not going to find some self-published book on Amazon and introduce it into their curriculum.
Right.
They need it to be very strongly validated, embedded. And so we decided to do a traditional publisher because that's one step on the pathway to my dream of having this be part of. Imagine first week of school, maybe it's not even a class that you take all semester long. It's just it's
Yeah.
like a little orientation. As part of your semester orientation, you learn how to use a digital notes app. That's like my dream.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And that was a big thing with Microsoft and Apple is getting the computers in the schools. That was a really key thing that they focused on. And my school was all Apple stuff. And so I was learning on the Apple and I was learning that UI and all that stuff. And I think, this stuff, it sets a foundation where you can even think about organizing information. You can even think about your own intellectual capital and like, hey, this isn't just for taking tests. This is something that I'm building up and my intellectual capital is in my second brain. So I need to invest in this. And in some ways, this is the most like a lot of companies, global companies now, their primary assets are their people and their intellectual property. And so the second brain is really the home where you're keeping all of that intellectual property. So it's, in some ways, nothing is more important than that.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's like a second brain is to knowledge what your first checking account is to your
Yep.
finances.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Checking
what
account.
what can you do in the world of finances without that first bank account?
Mhm. So I'm kind of curious, the book publishing experience. You have a really good blog post you did recently that I recommend everyone check out on kind of the experience. And actually, no, you have another one that's kind of a table of contents that lists links
Mhm.
to like 5 other blog posts. So that's one of the things I really appreciate you've done throughout your journey is you share all the experiments you've done. The documentary you did, the whole book writing process. You've documented all that, and it's all there. So if you want to write a book,
Mhm.
you go there, and you can see. I think I can't think of anybody else who's done, been as open as you have been with all the different kind of your journey and documenting what you've learned along the way. So I really appreciate that. And it's just a treasure trove of information on your blog. So I recommend everyone check that out.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
really that's really important to me. It's really important to me. Share the journey because then other people are on the journey. What's the point of the journey to just walk it by myself, all in isolation? There's really no point for me.
Yeah. So uh, I'm curious, like, what would have been the best experiences you've had? Like, you talked about the Google Talk, and I've seen some of the other speaking engagements you've had. But what have been maybe the best or maybe some of the most unexpected positive outcomes? I mean, I believe anybody who's like a real knowledge creator and is really trying to push things forward should write a book and challenge themselves to do that. And it's not that hard. It's not that big of a deal. Um, getting it published, through traditional, that's a little bit harder, but it's I think it's when you have a PKM, when you have a second brain, it's not that hard to write a book, because you're almost writing a book whether you're trying to or not. You're putting
Hmm.
together notes. Each, you figure out the big ideas. Each of those becomes a chapter. You weave it together into some kind of overarching framework, and you have a book, and it's not that big of a deal to just write it up.
Yeah.
So maybe you could, there's a lot there. Maybe some of that resonates.
Yeah, I would say it's exactly how I thought of it is writing a book. I don't even understand how someone can just like sit down and like start writing a book. Like it's impossible. I approached it as the synthesis of around 50 blog posts.
Hmm.
That's what it was. I had my 50 Lego pieces on my table, or like 50 puzzle pieces, and it was my job to fit them together somehow. And by the way, not only did the pieces already exist, but they've been extremely thoroughly tested, right? Like
Yeah.
in the context of the course, every single idea in that book has had, and not just a few people, but many, many, many people say, I understand this. It makes sense to me. I tried it and it worked.
Hmm.
And it stood the test of time, and I continue doing it over time. That was the bar, right? Um, but so it's funny that saved unfathomable effort, like unfathomable time and difficulty having all the building blocks. But also, it was still the hardest thing I've ever done. And I think the reason is what is not captured by this idea of assembling building blocks is like every single word in the book has to be coherent with every other word.
Yeah.
So, like, as one example, you know, like the simplest change, instead of digital note-taking app, I'm going to say notes app.
Hmm.
Simplification, right? But I can't just go in and just make that change, because now every mention of digital note-taking app has to be changed. Not only that, but I have to now communicate in other ways in other places that it's digital,
Hmm.
or what I mean by notes. What kind of notes? Where? I have to communicate that it's in software. So like it's kind of this like puzzle where changing every piece requires multiple other pieces to be changed.
Hmm.
And then you have to go and make all those changes, but then those changes trigger other changes. So it's this endless recursive loop of changes triggering changes, which happens from the very first moment to the last moment. And then eventually you just have to decide, okay, I've just made enough changes. You
Hmm.
never actually reach a final state. You're just like, it's good enough. And then you submit it.
So another major thing you're known for is the cohort-based courses, and you're a thought leader in that area. And so I'm curious, where do you see that heading, and how is putting together a course similar to putting together a book?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some big similarities and also differences. I mean, the similarity is that you're trying to teach a coherent arc,
Mhm.
beginning, middle, end, right? It's neither one is just a, random assortment of different tips and tricks, or else it
Mhm.
just won't be valuable.
Mhm.
But where they're so different is a book is final. You
Yeah.
turn in that manuscript for at least 10 years. It is what it is. It can't be changed. Whereas a course, the whole point, especially a cohort-based course, where you're sort of reinventing it and then re-delivering it every time,
Yeah.
uh, it's like because you can change it, you should change it,
Mhm.
right? Like the ability to change means that that's the main source of learning is constant change. But then that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to change and improve and shift things.
Mhm.
So they're good complements to each other. We did 14 cohorts of the course, 14 attempts, iterations, and then I got the best parts of every single one of those iterations and put them in the book.
Wow. So, another thing I forgot to ask you about this earlier. How has What have you found to be the most valuable aspect of creating like a family second brain? Like, um, putting, it's kind of like your team shared Google Drive, but I'm just curious if you've learned anything in that area, both with, your wife and your son, but also your parents, and kind of branching out your siblings and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. I got to go here in a few minutes,
Yeah.
Timothy.
Yeah,
Just a
definitely.
heads up. Um, So it's funny because this is a common question people have is like group knowledge management,
Yeah.
collective knowledge management, team knowledge management. And my current hypothesis is like I'm pretty confident that the methods I teach for personal knowledge management do not just directly extend to groups.
Mhm.
They just don't. Like I rely so much on informality, on contextual clues that only make sense to you, right? That's a very that's the path of least resistance. That's the low effort way to do that when you are communicating with yourself, collaborating with yourself, taking notes for yourself. It's all you. Like you have
Mhm.
that context.
Mhm.
But I find it's like the minute a piece of information, let's say a note, has to be intelligible and usable by others, the
Mhm.
standard of formality that it has to meet skyrockets. It's not a small jump. It's like 10x.
Mhm.
And the way that I see this is when people share their notes with me. People always, for some reason, want to be sharing their notes, like, oh, here's a notes on a book or this or that. It never makes any sense to me and is definitely almost never usable. I'm just like, okay, this is just like random thoughts and bullet points in a document. Like, no, this is pointless. So I'm just very conservative about saying, oh, yeah, just do this with your team. I think what more often happens is on any given team, there's the organized one,
Mhm.
right? It's like your group projects at school. There was like the one in the class, like the one in your group that was the organized one. Same thing in your family. There's the organized, like diligent one in your family. Same thing on your team. Same thing on
Mhm.
every like sports team. Every group has the person, and I'm not sure how this happens if they volunteer for this or if other people kind of go, okay, Timothy, you kind of have your stuff figured out, like you organize the schedule or whatever. But somehow or other, that person emerges. I think they should have a second brain
Mhm.
because they're probably managing the details for the whole group, just themselves.
Yeah.
And then what does everyone else do? They essentially rely on that person, which is what they're going to do anyway.
Yeah.
Like think of the people in your life. I mean, you could document everything to the utmost degree. What are they going to do? They're going to text you, they're going to call you and
Yeah.
ask you to find it for them.
I found they kind of resent if you try to, mold
Yes.
them into your, and they're not going to necessarily appreciate that. So,
No.
trying to impose this stuff too much doesn't always work.
No,
Uh,
it really doesn't.
yeah. So, we've covered a lot of stuff. And we're going to have some bonuses down in the description. We're going to do um, 5 new SOPs that was very popular in our previous interview. So we're going to be giving 5 SOPs from Tiago's second brain, standard operating procedures from his business, and then also the progressive summarization cheat sheet, which is one of the things I rediscovered just researching for our interview today. And it's one of my favorite parts of Tiago's system. And it's a very, I mean, it's pretty similar to how I approach notes as well, but it's uh, it's just a very easy thing to get started with and very effective. So, do you have any final words or thoughts before we wrap up today?
No, this was a pleasure. This was much nerdier than I'm usually able to get for
Yeah,
a fellow productivity nerd. But yeah, fantastic questions, and it's been a pleasure.
yeah. Thanks a lot for coming on. So, we'll wrap up here, and then people should go check out Tiago's new book, "Building a Second Brain." And also, I think right now you're on a schedule of twice a year. He opens up his second "Building a Second Brain" course. So definitely get on his email list. You're gonna get those announcements. And you have some other from time to time. You have some other courses as well, which are interesting. So definitely get on Tiago's list. So you get all those notifications. And Tiago, thanks again for coming on today.
Appreciate it, Timothy. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.